I'm Barry Gilreath, and this is Fabric of Family.
We came on a Sunday, one part of the Bible was backed up with the other part of the Bible.
The glory, revive us again.
You know, a family might be described as individuals abiding in an intimate, invisible grouping called a home, caring and sharing for the benefit of its members to be a helpmeet through life's daily events. You know, a family is a wonderful blessing when members of that family are fulfilling their duties and obligations. But when one or more of those family members fall short of the divine standard, well, the whole family is affected. Sometimes egregious harm can be done to the home and its members. In today's program, we're going to be discussing one of the travesties that occurs when an abusive family member leaves their mark on what really ought to be the nearest thing to paradise on earth. So join us now as we begin our program entitled The Dangers of Emotional Abuse.
Thank you for viewing The Fabric of Family. If you would like to receive free Bible study materials, please contact us. Our mailing address is 1031 Hermitage Drive in Florence, Alabama, 35630.
Never conceal my Savior and guide. He is a light.
Or you may contact us at our website, jhcc.org. That's jhcc.org. Or you can call us at 256-764-6291.
Jesus is mine.
That's 256-764-6291.
Mansions above, singing His praises, gladly I'm walking.
Our hope and prayer is to bring you and your family closer to God.
Well, it's time for our panel discussion. I have with me two guests. One is by the name of Robert Jeffries. And Robert is from South Haven, Mississippi. At least that's where he's working now in the Lord's Church at the South Haven Church of Christ. And it's good to have Robert here. I spent 5 years at the South Haven Church of Christ from 90 to 95, so we have that in common.
Yes, sir.
It's a good church and a good group of people. It's good to have you here with us today in this discussion. And then beside Robert, we have Russ Vickers. And I've known Russ for many years, and he's been very helpful with the Gospel Broadcasting Network. And you're doing some program now for GBN. You're doing the program
Focus on Faith.
Focus on Faith,
Yes.
yeah. And that's a good program, so
Absolutely.
Encourage folks to try to find that and watch that program as well. But you know, Russ, he spent a lot of time in Georgia. But most recently, you're now in Baldwin, Mississippi.
Yes.
You're preaching there, and it's just good to have both of you men here with us today. We're talking about emotional abuse. You know, abuse comes in all different forms and shapes and sizes, and a lot of times when we think about abuse in a family, the first thing we think about is physical abuse, or maybe sexual abuse that can certainly occur. But there is another, I suppose, side of the coin that we could consider and will be considering in this program, and that's emotional abuse, because it can be just as destructive as well. I think it would be good as we get started today to simply maybe provide a working definition of what we're talking about when we discuss emotional abuse. What is emotional abuse? I'm going to go to Russ and get your thoughts on that.
Well, when you talk about emotional abuse or any kind of abuse at all, we understand that this is a very uncomfortable subject for a lot of people. And just because the signs are not visible physically does not mean that somebody is not hurting on the inside. You know, you remember the old saying, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names will never hurt me? That's not true. Names do hurt. Words do hurt. They pierce. But if we had to put a definition on this, and Psychology Today had a good article on this, and it's defined as an attempt to control someone else through emotion and or words.
Right.
I would say that a big part of this is trying to put shame upon somebody else.
Yeah. And I think one key word there that you touched upon is the word control. Because emotional abuse is certainly the attempt to control. Is that right, Robert?
That's exactly right. And, you can control in a number of different ways. You can control a person through humiliation. You can control them by intimidating them, manipulating them. But it all goes back to this idea of controlling them through an emotional context.
Yeah. And even though, like with physical abuse, there may be physical scars that are very evident. If someone sees a child that's been physically abused, or maybe a spouse who's been physically abused, emotional scars sometimes are a little more difficult to see, but there are some scars that you can see in the way that it affects the child or it affects the adult who is being emotionally abused. As we think about emotional abuse, what are some behaviors that maybe a parent could engage in towards a child, or maybe a spouse could engage in toward their spouse, that could constitute what we're discussing, emotionally abusing someone?
I think many times people may not even realize that they're doing it, but some of perhaps the call signs to look for would be a person who's constantly being critical, or somebody who's being harsh or belittling. You're making a person feel as if they're just 2 inches tall, something of that nature. It could be with a case that there's name calling that's involved, manipulation that's involved, some mind games, maybe withholding affection, whether it's withholding from spouse to the other spouse, or parent to the child. And those things really play into a negative aspect into a spouse or even a child's life.
Sure.
I think about it from maybe a scriptural standpoint. Paul said, "Let us follow after the things which make for peace." And when you think about it from dealing with brethren, dealing with the church, we want to follow after things which make for peace. But if we apply that into the home, these things like criticizing and having these trust issues and being really hard, belittling and name calling, those things aren't going to make for peace. And I think every person deep down wants to have peace in their family, but we've got to make sure that we do the things that make for that.
Yeah, and sometimes maybe someone who's engaging in emotional abuse may think, well, my objective is to have peace in the home. That's the reason that I react like I react, because I'm trying to keep everything in control. Because if I wasn't, very adamant with this person, my spouse or my child, then who knows, what would happen to the family. What are some stereotypes that sometimes we associate with emotional abuse?
Well, when you talk about stereotypes, and there's quite a few of them out there, one of the things that people tend to say, or they tend to project the fault on the victim or the one who's being abused. And then they say, why didn't you just leave?
Yeah.
Leaving, well, it's not always that easy.
Yeah.
And another stereotype, and this is a common one, why it only happens to certain families. It only happens in certain demographics. It would never happen in my family.
Yeah. Let's stop right there before we go any further and touch a little bit more upon the first one that you mentioned, where there's a blaming sometimes that takes place. And maybe the abusive spouse might say, well, I wouldn't be this way if it weren't for you and what you're doing, or I wouldn't have to scream at my children if my children would just listen to what I'm saying. And so it's a very subtle way to transfer our own sins upon the other person and to remove ourselves from any responsibility. Isn't that correct?
That's true. Absolutely.
And then the other one that you mentioned, what was that one again?
It could only happen in certain families,
in
certain demographics. It could never happen to me. It could never happen in my family. Fact of the matter is, it can happen to anybody in any walk of life.
And it can happen in what's supposed to be a Christian home.
Sure.
And sometimes, Christian fathers or Christian mothers, again, they may rationalize the abuse that their reaping upon their children or their spouse because, they say, well, the husband's the head of the household. And if you're going to be the head of the household, you got to run a tight ship, Well, it's true. We need to be the head of the household, but sometimes the tactics that we might engage in order to assert ourselves as the head of the household or to assert ourselves as the authoritative one in a parent-child relationship, it's not biblical. It's harmful. And that's why we're doing this program today, in part because we want to talk about this and understand that we can still have disagreements with our spouse and we can still exercise discipline in our home, but we don't have to go to physical abuse to that extent. Neither do we have to go to the extreme of verbally abusing someone, emotionally abusing them. Any other stereotypes?
I think maybe another way to possibly look at it is, we got into an argument, so we start to attach blame. Well, they're abusing me, or they were blunt with me, or he raised his voice, kind of thing.
And
but
so that's the other side of the coin.
Right.
Yeah, where maybe someone wants to be the victim of abuse because they feel by being the victim, then I can escape the consequences of, my behavior. Right. And so, that's a very legitimate point as well that we need to think about. Well, let's look at another question here. Why do emotional abusers, why do you think they engage in these type of behaviors?
I think one reason may be is because their parents did it. And so they saw this, they saw mom do it, they saw dad do it, and so immediately we think about that old adage, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, or like father, like son, like mother, like daughter. And you go back and you think back in the scriptures, think about the kings. How many of them did evil in the sight of the Lord? For example, in 2 Kings 21, you got a man there named Ammon. And you think about his daddy was Manasseh.
Right.
And you see one right after the other. Of course, now Ammon's son, he decided he was going to put a stop to it and wasn't going to follow in the same direction. But I think a lot of times when there is abuse that goes on, well, this is something that I always saw. And a lot of times when you're counseling with people, well, why do you suppose you do this? Well, I saw my dad do it, or I saw my mom do it.
It's normal, because that's the environment that we grew up in. And so this cycle of abuse, and that's what it is, a cycle from generation to generation, continues if we're not willing to break the cycle and do things differently for the benefit of our family and for the benefit of our children who are watching us as well. Well, our time is just really getting away from us today, but what we want to do before we continue our discussion is take just a short break, and we're going to watch a short segment. It's one that is going to be done by Gary Hampton. Gary's going to be talking to us today about Joshua's advice for parents. So let's watch that, and then we'll be back to finish up.
Hello, and welcome to A Word for the Family. Some of the best advice that I have ever gotten came from older people. People who had experience. Occasionally, in fact, I joke with folks and say, well, you don't want to do that, and I'll tell you why, because I've been hit by that bus. And oftentimes that's literally the way we learn, is by mistakes, problems that we faced. It's always good to listen to older people because of their life experience. One example of that for the family, and particularly for parents, is found in the words of Joshua as he's closing out his ministry among the people. In Joshua chapter 24, he gives them basically a choice. Choose you this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It's the last part that I want to focus on. The first is fairly obvious. You can choose to go any direction that you want to, but the choice that you make is very important, and for that reason, Joshua makes the statement that he does. Notice that he begins with the words, as for me. You know, you really can't lead people from behind. And yet, sometimes it almost seems like that's what we parents try to do, is lead from behind. Joshua was not that kind of a man. He was a man that got in front of the people and made a choice. In particular, in this case, he got in front of his family and he made a choice. As for me, and we could just say it, I will serve the Lord, because that's really what he is stressing there. He had seen what the Lord was able to do. He'd seen all those 10 plagues that God used to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, through the wilderness, and now not only into the promised land, but literally helping them to defeat many nations, at least 7, that were greater than they were. So he said, as for me, I'll serve the Lord. But then he said, and my house. And I think herein lies a very valuable lesson for all of us parents. And that is, we choose for our families because we know the alternatives. We have seen what's going on around us. We know where certain choices will lead. You don't allow your children to go and associate with certain types of people because you know that they will be tempted and perhaps fall prey to that temptation. So you make a choice knowing what's ahead. You could be simple with that, talk about things in the physical realm and say, I used to choose when my children were at home for them to go take a bath. I knew when they needed one. I could smell them. I could see the dirt and so forth. Well, it works much the same way in spiritual matters. So Joshua said, as for me, and then my house. He made a choice knowing the alternatives. And then finally he said, we will serve the Lord. He had seen the rewards for serving the Lord. We've already talked about the great deliverance that the Lord had given them, but think about the rewards. Joshua and Caleb stood firm when the 10 other spies were wishy-washy, had weak knees, and encouraged the people to give up. Not Joshua and Caleb. They stood firm. They stood for the Lord. And because of that, they survived the 40 years in the wilderness when all the rest of their generation died. And they got to enter in. Both of them received the promises that God had given them. For that reason, he chose to serve the Lord. So parents, I want to urge all of us to do like Joshua did. First of all, make a choice to get in front and serve the Lord. Secondly, choose for your house because you know the alternatives. And third, be sure to choose the Lord because he rewards those who follow him. This has been a word for the family.
Well, we hope that you take heed of Joshua's advice to parents as Gary Hampton has just presented. We're back for our discussion, and we're going to finish up this programming on the dangers of emotional abuse in the house. Is emotional abuse really any less serious than physical abuse? And what's your thoughts about that? I'm going to go to Russ to start with.
Well, abuse is abuse, no matter what form it takes. And yes, it is serious because of, and a lot of people think about the short-term effects of abuse. Think about the long-term effects. The signs of physical abuse are more evident than the emotional abuse. The emotional abuse hits the heart.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, it's tough to hide scars on the face and on the body and everything like that. But because of this, in our minds, we think, a lot of people may tend to think that emotional abuse is no big deal. You know, that emotional abuse may be hard to recognize because it can be subtle, and because abusers often blame their victims. They often blame their victims, although the problem is that the victim can turn it back on the abuser in an easy fashion. And a lot of people will tend to believe what the abuser says more than the victim. It is a serious, serious problem.
Yeah, it is, and if you look at statistics, I mean, emotional abuse is just as rampant as physical abuse, maybe even more so, because it's so much easier to engage in emotional abuse than physical abuse, and because I suppose of the stigmas that are associated with physical abuse that are not necessarily as prominent when you're talking about emotionally abusing someone. Now, you know, Robert, a lot of times when we're thinking about abuse, physical abuse or emotional abuse, we think about the confines of the nuclear family, the home, like you know, between spouses or maybe parents and children. But is it not something that's even broader than that? As far as within the family, can we engage in?
Yeah.
And I would ask you, what are some examples of that?
Well, what are some examples of that? I think about even, you know, sometimes siblings when they're taking care of parents that are elderly,
Yeah.
and they're going to make decisions. Sometimes you see it in those families where you may have 3 or 4 brothers and sisters, but there's one person that they're always looking to for almost their approval.
Yeah.
But that person has been the controlling figure through the years, and it could be that they're controlling them by manipulating them. It could be through intimidation.
Yeah.
that this is going on. But you always kind of see them almost cowering in fear, so to speak. And I've seen that numerous times, especially when taking care of aged family members, that you have it going on even in the extended family years and years later. But this happened at some point, and many times it happened years and years in the past, and they still can't get past the mental scars of that.
Yeah, and so it's something that can be engaged in outside of the nuclear family. You know, grandparents, we can emotionally abuse grandparents. You know, here's a parent who gets upset with their mother or father, and so they say, you know, you're not going to see the kids anymore. And you know, that has an effect upon the grandparent. It also has an effect upon the children. And so that could potentially be an area of emotional abuse depending on the circumstances.
Yep.
Yeah, as a means of control,
Right.
To exercise control over that situation. Are there some dangers that are involved if we ignore emotional abuse within the family and say, oh, you know, that's just the way that daddy is, or that's just the way that mama talks to daddy? I mean, what are the consequences of ignoring it?
If these things are left unchecked for a long period of time, you can have anxiety disorders come into play with the victim. You can have emotional scars over a long period of time. Depression could set in.
Yeah.
And that's a big one right there.
Yeah, and we hadn't even touched on that, but you're right.
Substance abuse disorders may come up. And also,
yeah, people can turn to drinking or drugs to escape, you know, a bad home life. Yeah.
We talk often about, in other ways, about post-traumatic stress disorder. And there is no definite ending for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's different for different people. It could go on for a few years. It could go on for a lifetime.
Right.
And it's serious stuff.
Now, you mentioned something about addressing it. Should we address it, or should we leave it unchecked, and things along that line, and the effects that that Russ talks about, that it continues to be linked to, and things like that? I'm reminded from a scriptural standpoint. You know, when you look in the book of Acts, every time that the church had a problem, that when they addressed it, what happened? The church grew. The church was strengthened. And so maybe if you take that and you start maybe addressing those problems when they come up, it could have a positive effect that the family could actually grow and benefit from it instead of suppressing it and having that continue to go on.
Yeah, and one of the consequences can be that other types of abuse, you know, it can escalate. What starts as maybe emotional abuse, where maybe, say, a husband is emotionally abusing his wife to, you know, to keep her in check, to have his thumb on her, make sure she, you know, dots every I and crosses every T. But if that continues on, it can even lead into other types of abuse, like physical abuse.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And you see it perhaps go to physical abuse, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. Many of these things go hand in hand, and especially when you think of the drug and alcohol abuse, they're looking for some type of medicine. They're looking for an outlet because of the treatment that they've had. Sometimes, you even have, if a spouse continues to treat their spouse in a particular way, abusing them, it could lead them into the arms of somebody else. You think about it in regards to children. You abuse your children in numerous different kinds of ways. Well, they could start having emotional attachments in other ways, and that's where society has started to say, well, that's where we get these daddy issues from, and things along that line.
Yeah, and this subject we're talking about is just a very comprehensive subject. There's a lot involved, and I mean, we're just really getting started. What I'd like to do, gentlemen, is to invite you back on our next program, and I'd like to continue our discussion and maybe look at the other aspect of this, and that is not so much the abuse, but the therapeutic side. How do we heal from that abuse? I would love to have you back for that program.
Thank you for viewing The Fabric of Family. If you would like to receive free Bible study materials, please contact us. Our mailing address is 1031 Hermitage Drive in Florence, Alabama, 35630.
Never conceal my Savior and guide. Here's a light.
Or you may contact us at our website, jhcc.org. That's jhcc.org.
Flooding my soul with
Or you can call us at 256-764-6291.
praises, Jesus is mine. In the bright
That's 256-764-6291.
mansions above, singing his praises, gladly I'm walking.
Our hope and prayer is to bring you and your family closer to God.
Well, our time is gone for this program where we've been looking at the dangers of emotional abuse. Abuse is something that never ever should take place in the confines of a home. And when it does occur, then there are consequences that are going to be experienced. Because this subject matter is very vast and we've only touched the hem of the garment regarding this particular subject, I want to invite you to join with us next program, because we're going to be picking up where we left off today and continuing this important discussion. Until next time, I'm Barry Gilreath Jr., your host, wishing you and your family a wonderful week.
Revive us again, fill each heart with thy love. May each soul be rekindled with fire from above. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, thine the glory. Revive us again. And covers me there with his hand.